Hello everybody, I'm Bella, the head tutor at Hello Smart. I graduated with a score of 50 in English and a 99.95 ATAR, and today we're going to walk through exactly how to write the perfect essay for Oedipus the King. We had a couple of students do Oedipus the King last year, and many of them did very, very well in the end of year exam, including one student who scored 20 out of 20 for this section, despite averaging 60s when she started with us in August. So everything that we're about to go over for Oedipus the King is very relevant and will definitely help you out. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to plan this topic, then I'm going to show you a couple of other topics and how we can adapt that plan to those topics, and then I'm going to show you some of the body paragraph ideas you need to know in order to be able to do really well, and to always make sure you've got something to say no matter what question comes up. So first of all, fate controls every aspect of Oedipus the King. To what extent do you agree? So we have to work out, do we agree that fate controls every aspect of Oedipus the King or not? So there's a couple of ways you can plan this. Some schools do cause, response, consequence, others do beginning, middle, end. Either of those are fine. What we're going to do today though is we're going to do a true, false response to this. Because we've got a to what extent do you agree question, it's kind of nice to have two paragraphs which agree and one which disagrees or gives a slightly different perspective. So what we need to do is we need to start by brainstorming when is this statement true and when is it false. So when is it true that fate does control every aspect of Oedipus the King? Or what are the events which are primarily controlled by fate? And we're going to brainstorm a list for that. And then the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to consider which events are not driven by fate. And we're going to consider those as well. And we're going to brainstorm and work out which idea is longer. So which events are primarily controlled by fate? We'd be thinking about things like Oedipus returning to Thebes, potentially Oedipus defeating the Sphinx, Oedipus becoming king, marrying his mother, killing his father Laius on the path to Thebes. What else would be controlled by fate? So we'd brainstorm a couple of things for this. So Oedipus returning to Thebes, maybe some quotes from Tiresias about the inevitability of fate, Oedipus attempting to outrun his fate before returning to Thebes and unwittingly fulfilling everything he didn't want to do, Jocasta and Laius trying to avoid their fates as well by trying to get rid of their baby, and then Oedipus being fated to live a painful life. So these are all core events which feel primarily controlled with fate, so times that we agree with the topic. Okay, when do we disagree? So what things are not driven by fate? So probably we'd be thinking about times when characters have minimal free will. So we'd be thinking about Oedipus running from Corinth, and even though this does contribute to his fate overall, it is a small act of free will. So one sub-idea we could be thinking about for how fate doesn't control everything is perhaps how people have minimal agency over the way their fate unfolds. So while you can't determine a different B location, so everyone starts at A and they go to B, perhaps while you can't necessarily change the location that you're going to end up in B, you can perhaps change the route that you take from A on the way to B. So rather than taking a straight line, you can take a curvier one, which is what Oedipus does by outrunning his fate and then unwittingly returning to Thebes. So minimal agency over the way their lives unfold. Jocasta, you can do exactly the same thing. Laius as well, although he's not a speaking character. And you could also consider what else is not driven by fate. So I'd be thinking about ego responses. So potentially Jocasta's dismissal of the role of the gods. And I would also be thinking even more importantly about Oedipus's arrogance in trying to solve the mystery and also his willful blindness. So what's driven by fate? All these things. What's not driven by fate? Anything to do with free will, agency, or people choosing their own actions. So what we have to do now is we have to decide which of these lists is the longer one, or which of these can we split into two sub-ideas. So I can think of a couple of ways that we can shape these ideas up, and I can actually think of one way in which we could split this into two ideas and have this be our third, and one way in which we could split this into two ideas and have this just be our first. We could have two disagreeing ideas at the end. So for this one here, which events are primarily controlled by fate, there seem to be two sort of main ideas. The first main idea is the inevitability of fate. So people trying to outrun their fates, but ultimately failing. And we've even got a little idea here. So the inevitability of fate. So this would be people attempting to outrun their fate, but ultimately failing at that and having to live out those fates. All right, so that's inevitability of fate. The other idea that I see here that's quite interesting is Oedipus being fated to live a painful life. Because if you remember some of the chorus quotes, particularly in some of the later odes, I think off the top of my head, Ode 4, and also their closing statement at the end of the play about how it's impossible to count no man happy till he dies free of pain at last. So basically the entire point of the text is summed up in that last line, which basically says you can never decide whether someone's had a happy life or not until they get to the end of it, and you can assess the totality of events, because until someone dies, their fate is up in the air, their fortune is up in the air, and anything could happen to them. So even someone who experiences the highest highs, like Oedipus becoming king, can go to the lowest lows, learning that he has betrayed all the morals of his land and himself, and being shunned even by the very chorus, who in the stage directions inch away from him. So that's the second idea I would talk about, is how one's fortune can change. So the changeability of fate, how one can go from very happy to very sad in a very short period of time. So this I tend to prefer as a body paragraph 3 idea, just because a lot of the evidence for it comes at the end of the text, and it's nice if you can in essays often to follow a reasonably chronological order with your structure. So I would really like to end with the changeability of fate, just because that's one of the lasting messages that Sophocles leaves us with, although you don't necessarily have to. So those are probably the two ways I would deal with the inevitability of fate in Oedipus the King. Okay, but which events are not driven by fate? So again, we've got two things here. One is this argument I was talking about before, the minimal free will. So the fact that people have options in how they get from point A to point B. So minimal free will over the path one takes from A to B, despite being unable to change B, obviously. So that's the first point I would make. And the other thing I would talk about is what I was saying before about ego responses as well. So we can kind of already see there's two main categories here. So people like Oedipus are driven to be very arrogant and willfully blind when faced with characters like Tiresias and Creon. And so they're not really driven by fate, they're more driven by ego and human responses to crisis. So I would talk about the poor human responses to crisis, ego, pride, and the causes of suffering in the play. So if we've got this question, fate controls every aspect of Oedipus the King, to what extent do you agree? We can pick 3 of any of these ideas here. So I personally really like these 3. I think they deal really well with the fate aspect of the topic. They're all super on topic. This one here is a little bit different. You run the risk of possibly going a bit off topic if you're not very skilled at bringing the evidence back to a particular point you want to make. So our 3 body paragraph ideas could maybe be so I think we'll put this one as the third one. Inevitability of fate is a good one to put at the start, but we do have this argument about how there's minimal free will over the path that one takes. So we can maybe make this our first argument. So we'll make this body paragraph 1, and then we'll put the inevitability of fate second, and then we'll talk about the changeability of fortune third. And that will be our last idea, how ultimately, despite the inevitability of fate. One's fortune is very changeable and one lives at the whim of the gods. So if we were to write topic sentences for this particular topic, then we would have something like, in Oedipus the King, Sophocles illustrates how, despite the crushing power of fate, because this is going to be the main point of our essay, characters retain limited free will. And we would give all these examples here about Oedipus choosing to run from Corinth, so that quote about how I was running, always running, and Jocasta and Laius's attempts to fling their baby away by giving it to a henchman. You can put the full quote if you want. Okay, and then for body paragraph 2, we would do something like, the playwright conveys how fate ultimately controls the overall trajectory of characters' lives. So fate controls every aspect. We're saying yes, it controls the overall trajectories, and that's where we're going to give our key examples of Oedipus returning to Thebes, Jocasta and Laius trying to avoid their fate but ultimately achieving it, and then Oedipus being fated to live a painful life. Okay, and then for our third one, the changeability of fortune, all the examples we're going to use here are of how Oedipus rose to such power. I think there's that quote, a man beyond all power, but then ultimately lost that power and respect from everyone in the society. And we would also use all those examples of quotes from the chorus, particularly in the later odes, I think ode 4, and then the chorus's closing remarks at the end. So we do something like, ultimately, no character is able to escape their fate. Fate controls every aspect, and Sophocles suggests that the fortunes of man are ever subject to the whims of the gods. So that's how everyone's life is changeable and their fortune is fickle and could shift at any given moment. Okay, so that is how we would break down this topic. Fate controls every aspect of Oedipus the King. We'd say possibly not, but ultimately yes, we agree overall that fate and the hands of the gods determine the trajectory of characters' lives. So that would be a pretty good plan for this topic. Okay, let's now have a go at 2 more. The characters in Oedipus are prisoners of fate. Do you agree? So classic propositional topic. And in Oedipus the King, Sophocles advocates for both fate and free will. So let's start with the first one. So as soon as you planned one topic on a theme, you want to consider how much of the ideas I've already planned can I reuse for this new topic. And then the same thing for this one. So characters in Oedipus the King are prisoners of fate. So we would ask, when are they prisoners of fate? Well, they're kind of prisoners of fate because ultimately fate controls the trajectory of their lives. So already we can kind of use this idea again. So we would probably talk about the inevitability of fate. That's this core idea here, inevitability of fate. We could also talk about this one, so whims of the gods, and that changeability of fortune. So do we agree that they're prisoners of fate? Well, yes, and we can already reuse these 2 ideas. And then last question, are they prisoners of fate in this way, or is this a way that they're not prisoners of fate, perhaps? So we'd say probably yes, like there is limited free will, and we can either do it in terms of they can decide the path that they take to get there, even if they can't change the destination, or we could talk about ego, human responses, pride, Oedipus's response to Creon and Tiresias. So either of those would work. So pride would work, or minimal free will. So that's pretty easy. So you can see this plan here is really, really solid for anything to do with fate. You can mix and match it quite a bit to the different topics. Let's have a go at one more just to be sure. In Oedipus the King, Sophocles advocates for both fate and free will. All right, so we're going to ask, does he advocate for both? So when does he advocate for fate? Well, he advocates for fate in the fact that no one can change their fate. So these 2 body paragraph ideas turn up. And then does he advocate for free will? Well, in some sense, yes, because people like Creon and Tiresias exercise their free will very well. They're very rational and they're praised for that. They're depicted favorably in the text. But not always, because Oedipus also exhibits free will, and Jocasta does as well, but they're viewed in a much more critical way. They're depicted negatively by Sophocles. So as a result, Sophocles perhaps advocates for temperance in free will. So that would be a really interesting 3rd body paragraph idea. So again, we can take these ideas, inevitability of fate, whims of the gods and changeability of fortune. But for our third idea, what we would say is Sophocles advocates for free will that is paired with temperance. So Sophocles advocates for free will in the exercise of temperance, and perhaps criticizes those who act in a more prideful or arrogant or hubristic way, or who exhibit hubris, you could say. So we're taking this idea and we're just expanding it a little bit to match this particular topic. So as you can see, first topic you plan will take quite some time. You'll have to go through a big brainstorming process to work out what you want to do, and the first one will probably take you 40 or 50 minutes in general if you haven't thought about the topic before or the text before. But after you've done that, the subsequent ones should only take 20 to 30 minutes and then 5 to 10. And all you have to do is just make sure that you're tailoring it to the specific question. So if it asks you about advocating for free will, you can't just talk about how some people show free will. You have to say, does Sophocles advocate for it or show it favorably or not? So these are 3 different ways you can use a basic plan for fate to deal with Oedipus topics. That said, there are a lot of topics for Oedipus. We have over 40, I think, and we generate more all the time, which is similar to VCAR prompts. And you're not always going to be asked about fate in Oedipus the King. As you can see, there are a bunch of different themes, so you have to be prepared for anything that could turn up. So as an example of some weird things that you might get on different themes, how does Oedipus the King expose the best and worst of humanity? And Sophocles criticizes those who live without faith in Oedipus the King. To what extent do you agree? So how does Oedipus the King expose the best and worst of humanity? So for this one, we'd be thinking a little bit more about this pride aspect and when people are really good in humanity and when people are not so good. So again, we'd go back to this original brainstorming process. We'd either fit it to a true, false structure or a cause, response, consequence one. And we'd use that to work out what we're going to say. So we could do, for example, sometimes we see the best of humanity would probably be in temperance. So we're thinking of characters like Creon and Tiresias, who offer a very balanced approach to problems and who are very calm in the way that they deal with crisis, or at least very accepting of it in Tiresias' sense, despite all his complaints, possibly. So these are probably our best characters. However, we also see the worst of humanity as well in characters like Oedipus. So his arrogance, his irrationality, and his willful blindness are all things that we criticize in the text, or things that Sophocles depicts in a negative light. So these are probably the worst of humanity. But he also offers insights into times when people do quite inhumane things, at least by modern standards. So you could talk about Jocasta and Laius attempting to kill their baby. Pretty negatively viewed in the modern day. And also Oedipus's torturing of the shepherd as well. Perhaps more standard in Sophocles' day, but definitely is viewed in a negative light by a modern day audience. And at the very least, even if it's not quite viewed as negatively by an Athenian audience as it is by a modern day audience, it's still designed to show Oedipus sort of being a little bit nuts at this point in the play and going further than he needs to in order to get information, which he doesn't really need because he already sort of knows it deep down. So lack of humanity and arrogance. So there's 2 kind of ideas here. One is hubris, pride, arrogance, and the other one is lack of humanity. So in terms of the hubris and the pride, we'd be thinking of Oedipus here, but we would also be thinking of Jocasta's arrogance and ignorance towards the prophecies and the roles of the gods. So you can talk here about Sophocles' criticism of the sophists. This is a good point of historical context, which you can rely on if you want. And then lack of humanity, obviously, these things work really well. So I would probably say best and worst of humanity. We explore the worst of humanity through pride at the start, through lack of humanity through the middle, but ultimately temperance, which we see both at the start and at the end. So for Creon, make sure you talk about the start and the end for him, because you don't want a one-sided essay. You want to encompass as many aspects of the text and as many moments from the story as you possibly can. So that's probably how we'd deal with this one. We'd have 1 paragraph on this, 2 paragraphs on these. And then for this one here, Sophocles criticizes those who live without faith in Oedipus the King. To what extent do you agree? So we'd be thinking here about people who don't agree with the gods or don't listen to the gods. So there's a couple of body paragraph ideas we can come up with. One you might already see would be probably this one here. Arrogance and ignorance towards the prophecy, so hubris and pride. Again, that's a really cool one. So we'd be talking about how people who take credit for everything and don't acknowledge the role of the gods bring misfortune upon themselves. So note, we're using the same examples every time, Oedipus and Jocasta. And we would even use the same quotes every time as well. So Jocasta, for example, telling Oedipus to brush the prophecy from his mind. And Oedipus's quotes about how no god came to help him defeat the Sphinx. So those are all like the exact same quotes, the exact same points, the exact same argument about the dangers of hubris and pride, except here we would say hubris and pride exhibit the worst of humanity, whereas here we would say hubris and pride are examples of people living without faith, or people living with a human-centric rather than a religiously centered worldview. So that's the first one, hubris and pride. Who else lives without faith versus those who do not live without faith? So we'd go back through our ideas. Is there anything else we can use? So we would consider what ways do we criticize those who live without faith? So one is the negative depiction of these people. Another one is the suffering as a result of willful blindness or of arrogance. So you would be thinking about Jocasta's death here, as well as Oedipus's dark fate too. That would be good. Another thing you could do here as well is you could talk about the changeability of fortune. So, you know, the best laid plans always turn into disaster. We'd go through exactly those examples that we had above about how Oedipus was fated to live a painful life, and those quotes from the chorus in Ode 4 and at the end of the play. Okay, and how else do we criticize those who live without faith? Perhaps you could do something about the general power of the gods, so suffering caused by the gods. And for this, you could talk about the plague in Thebes. Heaps of good quotes from the start of the text, like Black Death luxuriates in Thebes, the deaths, numberless, grief upon grief. All those good quotes are really good for explaining how suffering is caused by the gods. However, you might then say, if you've been asked Sophocles criticizes those who live without faith, to what extent do you agree? You might notice that these three ideas, none of them really disagree with the topic. So you might want to take something like this hubris or pride one and show that it's like a slightly different take on living without faith. So it's not really like faithless, it's more like putting yourself above the gods. So perhaps this could be your third body paragraph idea. So you could move these two up. And then you could say, living without faith is bad for this reason, living without faith is bad for this reason. This one I'd actually probably put at the start because it's more evidence from the beginning of the text. Through the middle we see this. And then we could say Sophocles also criticizes those who not only live without faith, but who place themselves above the gods. That's how we could maybe broaden this topic a little bit and still cover the to what extent do you agree part. Another way you could deal with it is you could say perhaps he doesn't criticize those who live without faith. So you could give some examples perhaps of characters who seem to skate through perhaps without living the most faithful lives. Or perhaps instead you could have a paragraph about how he praises those who do live with faith. So that's another option. who live with faith or at least respect for the natural order. And in that case, you would probably be thinking about Tiresias and Creon, and just another paragraph about the benefits of being a rational person, benefits of temperance. So what can you do with all this? How can you use all this stuff? Because we've gone over a bunch of different things here. We've brainstormed a lot of things. How can you pull it all together? So what you can do, if you're clever, is you'll have noticed that a lot of the ideas we deal with actually repeat. So we've got a couple of ideas. The limited free will, so we'll write them down. What repeating ideas do we have? We talk about limited free will. We talk about the inevitability of fate. We talk about the changeability of fortune. These are our classic 3-body paragraphs for fate and fortune. We also have suffering caused by the gods. So the plague in Thebes, and suffering as a result of willful blindness as well. So 2 different types of suffering. We also have one about hubris and pride. Arrogance. We also have one about temperance. So the benefits of being temperate or of showing a more moderate approach to life. Okay, and if we scroll through, we've also got this one about lack of humanity. So I'll put lack of humanity here. And I'll also note, because you might also get some essay topics about leadership and what it means to be a good leader. So in addition to lack of humanity, you might also want to talk about pressures on leaders. So talk about how Oedipus puts all this pressure on himself to be a really good king, but this leads him to go follow these really extreme measures to abandon his responsibility to his people and just try and find his own story of his birth. And then ultimately as well, the fact that he sort of goes so off the rails that he ends up trying to torture the shepherd as well. So you can see all these ideas here are really, really useful and really important to take note of, because they turn up again and again and again. And no matter what topic you get, you'll always be able to use a mix of these ideas. So there's a couple of other ideas which are gone through in here in a bit more detail. All these sections also have detailed quotes for all of these different points that you might want to make. But for our purposes today, we'll just leave it here with our sample arguments. And I will say that if you go through all of these arguments and you come up with 3 quotes or examples for each, and you practice analyzing those quotes to back up each of these ideas, and then you practice adapting how you explain those quotes to make them make sense in the different topics. So for all the different prompts you could have, and you go through 40 or 50 topics and you make sure you're really confident adapting these different ideas to those topics, you should be set for Oedipus the King. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you found it helpful. Make sure to share it to someone else that you think might enjoy it.